Hi, everyone. Rejuvenation with Ari Harow on the Land of Israel Network. Today is Tuesday, December 19th, 2023, the seventh day of Tevet, 5784. Although, as my friend Adele Raymer, who used to live in Nirim, was evacuated after October 7th to a lot, she posts whatever day it is in October. You know, it's like the 89th day of October, because for her, October is just never over. So, we're deep still into the war against Hamas, praying every day, hearing about losses every day. And it's not easy to be here in Israel, but we are trying to function and do what we can on the home front. And so today I'm interviewing one of my favorite people who just coincidentally happens to have the same last name as I do, Ari Harow, who just published a book which when he wrote it, he thought he was writing kind of from a historical perspective. And it turns out that you could pretty much like pop this book into the front pages. So, Ari, first of all, thank you so much for joining me today. I know your eyes and ears and heart are always with the war, with the people you know, and everyone on the front. So thank you for taking a few minutes
Thank you.
to talk to me today and to my listeners. So, first of all, tell My Brother's Keeper, which is almost coming out in hard copy in a couple of weeks. I got to read it on PDF. Why are you so well placed, well versed, and so unique to tell this particular story?
Well, I won't go back into my entire history at this moment, but
Right.
At that time, the time that the book covers, I was the chief of staff to Prime Minister Netanyahu. And the book takes place in the year of 2014, a year that saw a bunch of, I guess, international events, geopolitical events, and military events come to a head. And being not only right next to the prime minister, but sitting in the war cabinet, in conversations with the president of the United States, both in the Oval Office and phone calls, and so on and so forth, gave me a very unique vantage point, both when it comes to the U.S.-Israel relationship,
Right.
and how the decisions are made, and how realities influence where we head as a country.
Mm-hmm. Which, I mean, I was just thinking because a few weeks ago, Gadi Eisenkot, who is, what is his official position? I don't think he's a minister without
He's
a
a
portfolio,
minister, correct?
right?
Correct.
But he's sitting in the war cabinet. His own son was killed in Gaza, and the next day his nephew was killed in Gaza. This is a very personal war. I mean, when you talk about this, isn't some war cabinet of some old guys just sitting around who have no connection to what's happening. They have all their skin in the game, many of them. Do you find I don't know if that's unique to Israel, or do you find that definitely impacts, you mentioned how decisions are made?
Well, firstly, I assume that it is somewhat unique to Israel, and I do touch on similar stories in 2014. I was actually at a work event a few days ago, and somebody brought up that exact case that you mentioned, and I recalled numerous incidents in the 2014 Gaza operation where we took it very personally, where tears were shed and emotions are thin in the prime minister's office. It's a difficult balance to strike as a leader, especially in the Jewish state, where on the one hand, to make the right decisions for the country on a much larger macro level, you have to try and separate yourself from the emotion, but at the same time, we're all connected here and everybody knows people. And one of the stories I talk about in the book is when the head of the Shin Bet, the Shabak, Yoram Cohen, comes to update the prime minister on the fact that they found the bodies of the 3 missing teenage boys.
Which is what kicks off this whole
kicks off the whole,
right.
the whole series of events, and ultimately the war in Gaza in 2014.
Mm-hmm.
And I want to give everything away, but
Right.
it just the emotions that I saw Netanyahu express was very heartwarming for me to see that even at the level of prime minister, and a prime minister that many don't expect to show those types of emotions,
Hmm.
feels the pain of every single Jewish Israeli that is lost.
I can't imagine how difficult it must be to Prime Minister of Israel, with all the criticisms, and some justified, some not, of him and of the other prime ministers. It has to be one of the most difficult jobs on the planet, because, as you
But
said, yeah.
I believe it is. I believe it is the hardest job in the world. And yes, there are prime ministers that have done better, and prime ministers that have done worse, and prime ministers that have done better and worse within their terms. But
Hmm.
ultimately, to constantly be facing existential threats on all your borders, and for those who didn't think that Gaza was really an existential threat, have been proven otherwise. Obviously, I'm not talking about, Iranian nuclear weapons coming from
Right.
Gaza, but the ability to draw us into a significant military excursion, and to put the entire country on hold, and to send a message to the region. Gaza and Hamas has done that. So facing those types of challenges day in and day out, in addition to everything else that this country brings along with it, the religious divide, the left-right divide,
Hmm.
the Sephardi Ashkenazi,
Right.
city versus periphery. There's a lot of challenges as an Israeli prime minister.
Right. And the unending criticism from the world, and especially, I mean, we're seeing it now perhaps more than in 2014, where it seems like it's pretty clear about the evil and the good here. There should be no gray area whatsoever. And then you have people that like head international organizations or major universities who can't seem to choke out what's good and what's bad. And that's incredibly depressing as a Jew, of course, and as an Israeli. So you talk about the relationship between the United States and Israel. And a lot of what's going on today is a question, are the Americans going to try and force us or somehow manipulate us into stopping this war before Hamas is really destroyed? But in 2014, the situation was possibly even worse.
It was definitely worse. I mean, I get that question all the time now, and I feel very strongly that the current U.S. administration ultimately has been fantastic in their support of Israel, as we deal with this terrible situation. In 2014, the Obama administration, led by its Secretary of State John Kerry, had very different ideas and very different plans. First and foremost, they did not have, to use the terminology that was used then, they didn't have our back. There were, multiple situations where international bodies brought Israel to debate, and the automatic veto that we have come to expect from friendly U.S. administrations was not necessarily there. It was, we were left hanging. We were left in situations where we truly did not know what the outcome was going to be. And that's not the sign of a real deep friendship. In addition, there was, we entered the Gaza battles of 2014 after 5 years of Netanyahu and Obama skirmishing, and shortly after the collapse of the talks, I guess the almost talks with the Palestinians, there was a extended effort by John Kerry in the U.S. to implement what they called a framework agreement to bring the sides to the table. That collapsed just weeks before the kidnapping of the three teenage boys. And in parallel, the U.S. was moving forward with the JCPOA with
Right.
the Iranians. So we entered the war in Gaza, where tension between the U.S. administration and Israel was at a high. And unfortunately, they were not able to completely separate themselves from those feelings and emotions as Israel dealt with Hamas and the Hamas threat out of Gaza. I do feel that this time around, the situation is vastly improved. The statements that we've seen out of the White House, out of Kirby, out of the Secretary of State, the Secretary of Defense, out of the president himself, the fact that President Biden got on a plane and came to Israel
Right.
in a show of support is unparalleled. And I think it's something that we have to be grateful for.
Yeah, you mentioned Kirby. He in particular has been outstanding. Just like clarity on the whole situation, as have people who are not necessarily in the administration, like a lot of military folk who are very much on Israel's side. And, they're not politically oriented, but they get it.
Right. I think, as you said before, Eve, that the just the magnitude of the massacre on October 7th and the visuals are so strong that you don't have to be a genius to know what is good and what is evil. And the fact that the US has clearly positioned themselves on the side of good is to be applauded, but it should be a no-brainer as far as the world is concerned. And unfortunately, the US is one of very few countries that have really stood by Israel's side the way that we could have expected.
So to go a tad off topic, because it didn't have to do with your tenure, which you went in and out a few times of the prime minister's office because he missed you and needed you. But as part of your personal world, you also did some extensive work in South America. So
Right.
how do you see, because I think a lot of times many people miss the diplomatic efforts that are being made around the world. We tend to focus on the countries that, just don't back us when we think they should. But there's a lot of things happening. The world isn't just the United States and Europe. There's a big world out there, and Israel sometimes gets support from places that you wouldn't necessarily expect, and because of personal contacts as yourself. So can you get into that just for a
Sure,
moment? I
of
think that's
course.
fascinating.
Of course. Between my terms with the prime minister, I spent a number of years advising leaders around the world. Spent extended time in South America, mostly in Paraguay, and worked in other countries in Europe and Africa as well. And there's no question that Israel, first and foremost, is extremely active in assisting countries around the world, third world countries and others, be it in the areas of agriculture, medicine, security, cyber, etc.
Water, yeah,
Exactly.
potable water.
And Israel does this both because we're a moral and just country, and we are truly look to be a light unto the nations and help out peoples and countries that are in need. And at the same time, it is a tremendous avenue for, I guess you can call it quiet diplomacy, where relationships are really built. I mean, one of the things that I learned in government itself is that personal relationships and personal contacts are more important than anything. I mean, there's a story that I touch on in the book about a trip that the prime minister made to Russia, to Moscow, in the beginning of 2010. And he and his wife, I believe it was his wife's birthday, and they went out to the Pushkin restaurant in Moscow, a very famous old restaurant with 5 stories. And I was sort of at that time, I was his bureau chief. And as you said, I mean, he wanted me near no matter where he was and no matter who he was meeting. And although it was a private evening, it was an intimate evening between him and his wife. As the prime minister, there has to be some staff with him. So I went and I took another staffer with me. We obviously sat at a different table. And while he had his dinner, and we had a drink. And as we were getting ready to leave, I spotted on a different floor the Prime Minister of Greece, Papandreou. And this was roughly around the time that Greece ran into their financial crisis.
Right.
And half jokingly, I said to Prime Minister Netanyahu, as the person who reformed Israel's economy, it may be worthwhile for you to give him some tips. So he asked that I invite Papandreou up for dessert. They had never met before. And I did. Papa Andreas and his foreign minister joined me, and we went up to Netanyahu's floor, and they spent the next hour and a half in conversation and struck up a friendship that changed the nature of the relationship between Israel and Greece. I mean, obviously with the change in attitude from Turkey, this became a very important
Right.
piece in the puzzle. There were some other events like the fire in the Carmel that Greece played a central role in. And all of this was a result of, a random, bump into at a Moscow restaurant. And that's not the only story. There's many such events that have taken place. I mean, in times that I was involved and obviously always. So quiet diplomacy and relationships are always very critical.
Wow. And I know, because I know you for your entire life pretty much, that a lot of this for you comes from a very deep place of feeling a role in Jewish history, of feeling that, this is what, if God gave you certain gifts, this is what you have to use them for. And you do.
Growing up in our family,
Mm-hmm.
first in Los Angeles and then making Aliyah. And I don't want to start crying, but like that was, that was the most important thing, or the most important ideal that was given to me, and that I was raised on. Making Aliyah to the Shomron during the time of the first Intifada, and serving in Golani in Lebanon and in Yehuda v'Shamron, just further strengthened those feelings. And once I finished my studies, there was nothing else that I could see myself doing, other than doing my part to strengthen the state of Israel and the people of Israel.
Mm-hmm. Which, while it sounds all full of glory and having drinks at the five-star restaurant in Moscow, I know comes with a very high price to be paid, especially with personal life. I mean, simply never being
Yeah,
home. And you mentioned that in the book, that there were
yeah,
months where you almost didn't see your kids at all.
yeah, yeah. I mean, probably years more than
Mm-hmm.
months. Netanyahu is a very hard worker. I personally found him someone that was relatively easy to work with. He's not somebody that gets angry and yells and screams. I mean, he's just very, very committed to the job, and that means working around the clock, and even when you are at home, being available. And it was extremely taxing, both personally and physically for me during those years, but I wouldn't change it for anything.
So without necessarily getting into specifics, you and the staff around him are clearly people who are ideologically committed to Israel. There have to have been some times, for example, the Bar Ilan speech that kind of alluded to a Palestinian state, that on the one hand, you've got loyalty to your boss. On the other hand, you have your own personal feelings as well.
Right.
What do you do with that when you are in, that kind of a milieu?
Um, so I learned an important lesson when I was with the prime minister, and that is that sometimes, and I don't mean to be quoting Ari Sharon here, but what you
One
see from
time, I'll let
here,
you do it
right?
one time.
Exactly.
Yeah.
What you see from here is not necessarily what you see from there. There are considerations and calculations that the public, first and foremost, is not privy to. And secondly, we live in an era where we're inundated with information and media, and you're caught up in that issue. So, I mean, taking the Bar Ilan speech, as an example, that was the debate. Should he or should he not be giving the speech? Should he or should he not be saying what he said? And ultimately, definitely with certain prime ministers, there's, much broader strategic goals in mind that need to be taken into consideration and that you can't necessarily explain minute to minute. And I think that lots of times that comes into play, and you have to sort of internalize that and allow it to to sink in. You may not always love it, but sometimes that's just what you need to do in a position of leadership. I can give you one example. It was during that first term with President Obama, where and I write about this in the book, where President Obama said to Prime Minister Netanyahu in the White House, not one brick, meaning no building in Yuda v'Shomron
Jewish
at all.
building. Jewish
No
building.
Jewish building.
Yeah.
Right, right.
Mm.
And ultimately, an agreement was reached between the Israeli government and the U.S. government, where there was going to be a freeze, a building freeze. I believe it was for 7 months. And the prime minister invited to the prime minister's office the heads of Yesha, the mayors from Judea and Samaria, and of course, as you know, the token settler in the office, he had me sitting next to him to kosher the move. And as difficult as it was for me to support that type of decision, I had a deep understanding of where the prime minister was going with it and what his ultimate goals were. And I was able to convey to the heads of Yesha that, if there was, I don't know, if it rained for 7 months and you couldn't build, would that be the end of, settlement enterprise? And the answer would be no. So, okay, so 7 months is 7 months, and we'll get past it, and and we'll make up for it. But sometimes there are larger strategic goals that can't be discussed publicly.
I think it's important that you say that, because everybody wants to know everything. And what I've been trying to explain to you is I'm okay not knowing everything, because anything I know, Hamas knows. Like, if it's public, it's public. And sometimes I think we forget that. And since it seems that especially now, they are very, very into the Israeli public, especially Sinwar has spent his life studying Israeli reactions because they are manipulating us. There's a lot of psychological warfare, especially around the hostages, which is a heartbreaking topic in and of itself, because maybe to save hostages, you're going to end up sacrificing soldiers. So there's no doubt about it that you're going to do that. So, I think it's important that you say that so coming from the inside, it's not like you want to be secretive, but for the greater good, not everything can be talked about.
There's a built-in, I completely agree with you, Eve. There's a built-in difficulty especially when you talk about battle or war between a democracy and a terrorist entity. We try to play by certain rules, including free speech and free press, where information is shared. And they do the exact opposite. They will use those rules and they will use our openness against us. And they do. And it's again, a very difficult balance to strike that the leadership, the IDF, has to play in order to keep us informed and make sure that we can continue to support the leadership in what we're doing, while at the same time remembering that, as you said, every single television program, every tweet, every viral video that gets out there, the Hamas is seeing. And not only are they studying it and learning from it, they're manipulating us, as you said, in their own ways, and they push their own messaging into the Israeli public through very treacherous ways as well. So yes, I completely agree with what you're saying. It's not you want to know everything, but it's definitely not in the interests of Israel or in the interests of the Western world.
Yeah, well, I think I know what I'm suffering from, and I think what many Israelis are suffering from is within that, we have to have trust in our leadership. Like, I don't know what's going on, but they do, and they're going to put it all together. And that's part of the blowback of October 7th for many of us is, how did that happen? And who can we trust now? Because there were some major failings that led to that day.
No question. I think that there's not a person in Israel who was not extremely scarred by what happened on October 7th in more ways than one. Yeah. And definitely when you look at the leadership from wall to wall, just thinking to yourself that they failed us. And they did. I think that the silver lining since October 7th is the people of Israel, is the volunteerism that we're seeing, the giving, the the 150% turnout to reserve duty, including your children, and just the tremendous and deep desire for unity that you feel in the country. And I think that we're currently benefiting from the fact that that feeling has sort of rose to the top in the sense that while we still have our reservations about the leadership, and I'm trying to be diplomatic in those words, we understand that everybody from the leadership all the way down shares the common goals of bringing home the hostages, of destroying the Hamas once and for all, and making sure that that type of threat to Israel never returns from our southern and hopefully northern border as well.
Yeah, I mean, you talk about the tremendous unity, and your book brought me right back to the year 2014 when the three boys were kidnapped, and how everybody was just focused for 18 days, even though it turns out that they had been killed at the very beginning, on, like you'd meet someone in the street. Did you hear anything? Did you hear anything? Like that was all we could think about. And I mean, it's unfortunate that it's attacks and it's tragedies that bring us together. But yeah, what's happening here in Israel, and I'm running a solidarity mission next week, so people can get just a little bit of a glimpse of the greatness of the people here and the bravery of the soldiers, which is, I don't know if it's I think it's unparalleled, but
yeah,
right, just
completely,
wow.
completely. I really feel like we're living in possibly, and it's amazing to say this after the tragedy of October 7th, but maybe in the greatest period in Israel's history. Just the unity from right to left, from Haredi to Meretz, and the togetherness of and the self-sacrifice of our soldiers and policemen is just incredible. I've said for quite some time that if it wasn't for two groups in Israel, we'd be we'd see this more often. And that's unfortunately the politicians and the media. I think that we deserve politicians that embrace these feelings that you and I are talking about. And we need a media that's not going to encourage the divide, but rather try and mend the differences. I said to a mutual friend of ours who lost his son not too long ago as part of in this war, Yechiel Leiter, and it's something that he has embraced and promoted since losing his son Moshe, and that is that 80% of Israelis pretty much agree on about 80% of the issues. We're living in an era where, there's no more socialist camp and, capitalistic camp. And there's no real debate on should we be creating a Palestinian state in Judea and Samaria today. There's no argument over dealing with the threat of Iran and its nuclear ambitions, and there's no debate over whether or not we should be expanding the circle of peace to other Muslim countries, as we did with the Abraham Accords. It's almost funny to see the most right-wing settler from some yeshuv someplace, and the most left-wing Meretz activists from Tel Aviv pretty much agreeing on these things. And if we can avoid the noise that these groups try and promote in order to differentiate themselves from their competition, then maybe we can retain this type of unity, which is so needed and so blessed.
So when we talk about your book for the 2014, talking about Hamas, talking about a tragedy that propels us into a war, which we didn't finish. I mean, we did not get rid of Hamas in 2014, and they seem to have gotten so much stronger in the interim, and the tunnel networks that are being uncovered, and the phenomenal amounts of money that have been poured in, which of course hasn't helped anybody except for the terrorists line their pockets. So, nearly a decade later, and we are unfortunately, being harmed by not taking care of it then. But from where we are today, as opposed to 2014, was there a threat ever of a regional war, as it seems, at least for today, that it looks like, the Yemenite, we got the Houthis who are pretty much making passage in one of the most important waterways impossible, and now there's a coalition going up against them. You have Hezbollah in the north here in Israel. You have Iran doing its mischief everywhere it possibly can. Was that the situation in 2014 where there was a fear of a greater war, the way we really seem to be on the verge of having now?
It wasn't as prominent as it is now, but anytime Israel goes into battle, not only does that fear exist, but contingencies are in place in case something does happen. You know, the one commonality when you talk about what's happening today with the Houthis and Hezbollah and so on and so forth is Iran. Iran funds all of these groups. Hamas, and I say fund, but it goes well beyond that. They arm them, they train them, they coordinate with them. So when you talk about the Houthis, you talk about Hamas in the south, you talk about Hezbollah in the north. Syria, there's been numerous attacks over the last few months emanating from Syria. That is Iranian based. There's been attacks from Iraq, whether it's on American interests or Israeli interests. Those are coming from Iranian proxies. Iran is the head of the snake that is poking Israel and ultimately has a desire to destroy the state of Israel. These aren't my words. These are their words. For many, many years, the world has adopted a stance that sort of accepts the fact that this is just rhetoric. And Iran is a country just like all others, and they're not actually going to use their nuclear capabilities if they reach it against the state of Israel. I think October 7th has proven that wrong. These are fanatical religious extremists that are willing to sacrifice their people, their cities, their states, their future, everything, if it means destroying what they call the little Satan. And this was true in 2014, but we were able to contain it in dealing just with the terror tunnels and a limited war in Gaza. But ultimately, what we see today is a reality that Israel's faced for a long time, and Israel's spoken out about for quite some time. Whether or not the world recognizes that and is able to internalize it remains to be seen.
This is not just Israel's problem, but we did have prime ministers, notably Menachem Begin in 1981, who took out the nuclear, whatever that was, in East Iraq, and even Ehud Olmert, who is way down on my list of people that I would want to have a cup of coffee with. Even he was able to, to strike at Syria. And it, of course, begs the question, in the past 9 years, could there have been a chance, instead of kicking the can down the road, could there have been a chance for us to maybe minimize the impact that Iran is now having today?
Right. So I think that the underlying theme in my book is really Iran. As we've talked about, I speak about the kidnapping of 3 boys, the war in Gaza, the relationship with the U.S., but the underlying evil through all of that is Iran. Iran has been at the forefront of Netanyahu's concerns for decades. He, to his credit, had brought Iran to the forefront of the international stage. And any debate and any action that has taken place by the international community over the last 20 years is really a direct result of Netanyahu's prodding and obsession with this issue. Should Israel have done some, should Israel have taken action? I guess history will be the judge of that. Ultimately, I don't know exactly what I'm allowed to share, so I'll be cautious with what I say. But the idea of Israel acting is not fiction. I think that Israel, with any threat anywhere, does plan, does put pieces in place to protect itself and act when needed. should we have done something before October 7th, 23? Um, only history will tell.
Hmm. It's strange being in the part of the time where that historians will be delving into, we're writing it now. And I mean, I guess anybody is at any point in time, but it just seems like there are some very, very, very big things brewing, not just for Israel, but for a lot of people around the world. And
I couldn't agree more.
yeah.
Yeah, for years when I would speak to visiting delegations from the U.S. and elsewhere, and got into the Iran issue, I would always start off my speech by saying, let's assume just for a minute that Iran acquired nuclear weapons. They dropped it on Israel. We're gone. Okay, we're wiped off the map. And now let's talk about Iran.
Right.
Now let's talk about Iran. How do you feel? What should be done? And because as we see today with the just prejudice and hypocrisy and animosity that's built into the international community towards Israel and unfortunately towards Jews,
right.
They're blinded by this hatred towards us, to the point where they're jeopardizing their own future by allowing an evil regime, an evil empire to acquire nuclear weapons. And I just always found it as a useful tool to say, okay, we're gone. So your hate can be channeled elsewhere. How do you want to deal with Iran? It's a historic moment that we're living in, not just for Israel, but for the world. This is coming to a head, and let's just hope and pray that us being a light unto the nations is not just in our morality and our help towards countries around the world, but in helping them see what true good is and what true evil is, and dealing with it.
And whose side they should be on. I mean, I don't laugh too much these days, but one sign that always gets me going is Queers for Palestine. Really? Really?
Right.
Wow, just show your ignorance in 3 words. Just an amazing thing. So, Ari, when does the book come out, and where can people get it? Would you be available for book tours? Because I think that, and I think that people got that from this interview, that, we know the big ticket events. We know there was a war in 2014. There's another one in 2016. But the decisions that were made, the small things that turned into really big things that kind of, snowballed into this and into that, into where we are today. I don't think too many people know, and definitely not from your perspective, which was about as close to the plate as anybody, could have been. And obviously you can't share everything in the book. And so I'm sure there's some things that you're never going to be able to share, but as much as possible to really understand how we got to where we are now. So what's the story with the story?
Yeah, so you're 100% correct. It really, like you said at the beginning of this, when I wrote this, a year and a half ago, I had, could not have dreamt up the nightmare of October 7th and where it would lead us. And looking at 2014 through the lens that I share in the book, really gives you a deep understanding and a perspective of the decision making within the prime minister's office, the prime minister himself, and a lot of the intimate conversations that we had around dilemmas that are very similar today, whether it's hostages or dealing with Hamas, or how to deal with pressure from the United States and elsewhere. And I think it's more relevant than ever. And
it's still the same prime minister.
And it's still the same prime minister, and some of the same players as well that were involved in 2014 are sitting around the table there today. So the name of the book is My Brother's Keeper: Netanyahu, Obama, and the Year of Terror and Conflict That Changed the Middle East Forever. And you can find it on Amazon, Barnes and Noble, and pretty much any large book selling website. And I am available for events. I'm going to be doing events in the United States initially the first half of February. A few events lined up. I'll be doing events in Israel as well. And I would love to connect with anyone who is interested in hearing more.
How do they get in touch with you?
That's a good question. I guess the easiest would be my email, ariharow@gmail.com.
Okay.
Harow with
One
one.
R, yes. That's the family joke.
Right, exactly.
Exactly. Okay. All right.
Yeah.
Terrific. So, yeah, it turns out that your book was really, wow. I mean, I know it had got held up because it had to go through the censor and all kinds of other things. And it turns out, and it happens in all our lives. We get frustrated and you think, oh, like I'm waiting and I'm waiting. And then it turns out that there was a reason that something was delayed that you could not have imagined. And here you are really laying out in such a fascinating way a lot of the events that we're living through today. Yeah,
So true.
absolutely. Absolutely.
Thank you, Eve.
Wish it could be different, but at the moment it isn't. Hopefully the ending will be amazing. Okay, or not the ending, but the ending of this particular chapter in our history will too many tears are being shed. And it would be nice if the price that we pay for living in this incredible country was a little bit, less than it is.
Yeah, I completely agree, and I do feel though that with all the pain and tears that we all feel on a daily basis, I mean it's heartbreaking. Every soldier that's killed, every life that's lost, the challenges that every single home in Israel is facing. But at the same time, there's a tremendous, tremendous pride living in this era after thousands of years where Jews couldn't defend themselves. When you look at past pogroms and Holocausts and Inquisitions, and the fact that we've recovered and we've just turned the page and took the fight to the enemy, and seeing the beauty of the people of Israel and the togetherness that we spoke about is just really awe-inspiring. And while it's a time of tremendous tragedy and heartache, it's also a time of pride and just patriotism
And potential. And
Yeah.
potential to really finally make the world a better place. We just want to be left alone to do that. But when we have to fight, we know how to do that as well. And that's not something that we were privileged to do for a long, long time. And basically, don't mess with the Jews anymore. Okay, we can be the best friend you ever had, and we can also be your nightmare. Okay, if you mess with us and you hurt our children, and that is the bottom line. So Ari, thank you so much. Ari Harow in his new book, My Brother's Keeper. Eve Harow, his very, very, very proud aunt, and very honored to have spoken with you today. Thanks to Ben and to Tabitha for putting out the show. For all of you for listening, you can always be in touch with me and, of course, be in touch with Ari. And I hope wherever you are safe and you have some moral clarity, because that's part of where we need to go. Eve Harow, Rejuvenation on the Land of Israel Network. Take care, everybody, and goodbye for now.